Are you troubled by strange noises in
Came
the
out
night?
a 6-foot black silhouette of a cowboy with a cowboy hat. He had a duster on.
You said there's lights in the sky?
Yeah, there's a full lot. It's moving real slow. Real slow.
It's showtime.
The Emit Blackwell Show, diving into the creative minds of sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and paranormal authors. Their fantasy is our reality. Welcome once again to the Emit Blackwell Show. Before we begin, I want to remind our listeners to share, like, and subscribe to our channel to get all the updates on all your favorite independent authors. I have special guest here, Colin Harker. She is a screenwriter and actually a blog fiction writer, and she's got quite a bit of things going on. She's got her hands in quite a few things. So, Colin, are you out there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. And so the first thing I want to ask you, and this is one of the first things that we ask just about all of our authors, but I'm starting to notice that you're a little bit more than just an author. When did you begin writing?
So I guess I've kind of been writing ever since I was a little kid. I mean, goofy little sort of one-shot fanfic type stories.
Mm-hmm.
I was a big fan of the Benicula series by James Howe when I was a kid, and I kind of tried to write stories in that vein, like when I was around 12, 13. But I guess I kind of like started seriously writing when I was a teenager in terms of like really wanting to get stuff out there and send them to magazines. So yeah, I guess ever since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm. So it was basically a hobby when you first started out, and you said that you got into fan fiction, which is something that we haven't even really talked about on this show yet. Now, when it comes to fan fiction, because you have all the rules of each character, it's almost like a set of rules that you have to follow within the genre of what this character is capable of, what they're not capable of, and how to build a story around that based on somebody else's concept. Have you found that fan fiction is fulfilling in some way?
Yeah, actually, I think it's a really great writing exercise, even when you're kind of an advanced writer.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's not really, trying to follow the rules of how a certain character that a creative has already created is helpful, but also kind of mimicking their writing style as well is a really useful writing exercise. I mean, when I was around 14, 15, and I first started reading Lovecraft, I wrote so many Lovecraft pastiches, which I know, I'm not alone. Like that's sort of a rite of passage for a lot of horror writers. But really kind of getting into his style taught me a lot kind of about what sort of the kind of syntax I was going for, the vocabulary, the atmosphere, the types of characters. And when I finally started sort of diverging from the Lovecraftian pattern, I feel like even then I was sort of learning like what about his style, what about his plots and characters worked for me, and what I kind of wanted to do on my own. So I think sort of the constraints and also sort of the innovations that fan fiction or pastiche writing introduces can really be helpful for a beginning writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another thing too is like with schooling and things like that. You're currently working on a PhD, correct?
Yes, I am. My focus is 18th century British novels with an emphasis on Gothic literature, shockingly.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that, I mean, some of our listeners might not understand this, that what you're going into is almost like a history lesson. It's the researching of English literature, past English literature, and then you have this creative side where you want to create new things. Do you ever find that there's a conflict between those?
I mean, I definitely feel like there's sort of a double life thing going on, which is kind of interesting because, I work in literature professionally. So it definitely is very closely related to what I do creatively as well. But the discipline is so different. I mean, like you said, when I'm working on my academic writing, I'm basically researching the history. I'm really analyzing these old novels, and when I'm doing my creative writing, it's a completely different world. It's different people who I work with, and a lot of the time, it's kind of difficult to tell people from academia, like, I'm working on creative fiction, this is what I do. It really does feel like this kind of secret life in an alternate discipline that's sort of related but not completely.
Yeah, and when it comes to something like that, I mean, for those who may be out there who are listening, some of you who are going to be aspiring authors, some of you who want to be that next great novelist, are going to school for English-related careers. And now you chose the English literature path. Did you find anything, like, what were the positive and the negative sides of taking an English course?
Well, I'll be honest. I think that focusing on English literature, or just literature in general, is a really good decision for writers who want to work in academia and also write on the side. The reason, I think, is I have actually found that having a job that steeps me in reading and really kind of almost coldly clinically studying literature is ironically actually really useful in terms of kind of generating ideas for myself. Like, I'll just, I'll spend a day like just steeping in Percy Shelley or Byron's poetry, and the Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis, and that's like my work, and so I'm kind of having to really understand their syntax and understand like what they're saying in the historical context, and I find that I actually come up with a lot of my best ideas while I'm doing that kind of like cold clinical work with literature. And the reason that I'm kind of saying that I think it's a really good decision for writers who want to stay in academia and also write on the side to work in the field of literature is I personally kind of decided early on when I was an undergrad that I was not going to be a creative writing major. And the reason is that in the department that I went to, there was like a very strong animosity towards genre fiction. And I've talked to other people on Twitter and other places about their experiences in different departments that have creative writing classes. And their experiences have almost universally been exactly like mine. That there is like a lot of real hostility towards genre fiction. When I was like taking creative writing courses in undergrad, I would sometimes like the teacher would just be like, "Oh, this is like Edgar Allan Poe drivel," and just be like very dismissive. Like you would think being compared to Edgar Allan Poe, which by the way I do not think I deserved at all, but like being compared to him, like you would think would be a great thing, but it was like really not a great thing in that context. Like they were really going for like a very, very narrow kind of subgenre of I guess what you would call kind of like mainstream literary fiction. I'm not totally sure, but it was definitely not like sort of horror, science fiction, fantasy was not something they were interested in. Now, not all my experiences were terrible. I actually took an online course in high school, which was fantastic. It was absolutely welcoming of every type of writer. And I have nothing but praise for it and the teacher who she was fantastic and so encouraging and helpful. But college level courses, it's a different story. It's actually funny because Stephen King, he wrote it like back in the early 80s. And
I have to stop you real quick.
Oh yeah.
Stephen King's It, okay? Now, I don't know if you've been listening to our shows, but Stephen King's It has been showing up in our show at some point every show. Go ahead, you can continue. As far as
Are you serious? That is so funny.
I don't know.
And
I
kind
think
of creepy.
Yeah, it is creepy, and I think that either Stephen King is going to sue us, or he's just going to come on the show. I hope he comes on the show. But anyhow, you were saying that it can be comparative to Stephen King's It. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying there's It is a massive, I don't know if anyone has ever looked at this book who hasn't read it, but it's like about as big as the Bible.
Oh yeah.
And so there are like lots of things in it that are not in the movies. And like one of the episodes in the novel has to do with kind of like the back history of one of the young protagonist, like when he's an adult, and he actually is a writer. And I'm totally blanking on the guy's name. It's the kid who stutters.
Yeah.
He grows up, becomes a writer, and he actually takes a creative writing course in college. And I love this chapter because he has the same experience I had of like his professors basically being like, you need to stop writing genre fiction, like it's not real literature. And I realized while I was reading that, like, I don't know if King ever took these classes or if he talked to people who took them, but this has been going on for decades, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a real problem in academia, honestly.
Well,
Yeah.
think about it too. Is you said that you had started kind of with fan fiction, and to be a fan of the great classics is one thing, but to almost be a fan of an entire genre of, like you said, Gothic type literature, or literature related to Edgar Allan Poe and those types of groups. It's like, had it not been for those writers and inspiring so many other people, we would have never come to the spot that we're in. So it's almost like we're all at a stepping stone. We all have that moment where we say, you know what, I'm going to write something. It needs to be something that I can relate to, and it needs to be something that my readers can relate to. But I also have this fascination with Edgar Allan Poe stories, and I want to recreate something in a whole nother way, but keep that same style, because that style is just so authentic. We do the same thing in fashion. We do the same thing with our automobiles. We recreate styles because it's almost like nostalgic. So I mean, I appreciate what you're doing because it's great, and I don't see why a professor wouldn't see that, that it is being used, it's being utilized. It's almost like a carpenter, okay? If a carpenter couldn't build a house, or at least where would he start building a house? He would have to start small, building a doghouse, and how many people have built doghouses over the years? Thousands, hundreds of thousands. So it's almost like building up your own repertoire of how you present your story. So I think it's an awesome stepping stone. I think it should be celebrated, especially at the college level.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that metaphor of kind of craftsmanship is really great. And I think that really there's sadly very little respect in creative writing circles, academic creative writing circles, for this kind of love for genre writers. I think that in those circles, fan is a dirty word. If you're kind of like a fan of Poe, or if you're like a fan of King, and you want to write something that's authentic to yourself and your experiences, but also kind of reflects them either stylistically or thematically or whatever, that's frowned upon. And it's a little hypocritical because in those same circles, they're constantly having, their students read Hemingway and, the art of style and all of this kind of, you have to write in this very pared down, like, no purple prose allowed fashion. And if you do anything that diverges from that very, very narrow kind of idea of what constitutes good literature, then, you're just producing kind of pulpy crap or whatever. And I mean, it's completely arbitrary. Like, why is Hemingway still kind of seen as like the greatest short story writer that America ever produced? And don't get me wrong, Hemingway is amazing. And I think that young writers can learn a lot from studying him. But I just think it's a shame that in their kind of zeal to have young writers read these early 20th century kind of basically like modernist literary writers, that has kind of become the only kind of fiction that they want to produce.
Well, see, and that's another thing too, is it's almost like you said, hypocritical, because for one, take a look at Hollywood right now. Okay, just take a small little smidge of Hollywood and you will realize one very simple concept. Hollywood's not real big on original ideas right now. They're real big on nostalgia, remakes, and recreations of something that's already been created. So when I look at things like, for example, that's the whole reason why this show got started, looking at independent authors and the creative ideas that they have and their independent ideas and completely separate from anything that's already out there. The fact that you look at Hollywood and then you look at the professors of colleges and they're saying, oh, no, you have to be independent, you have to make your own ideas. And they get out into the real world, and what happens? They're not fitting into a conformed style of what Hollywood and what the literary world wants to see, so then they don't get picked up by agents. And so it's so disappointing. But for example, like you were saying, it's good to start that kind of that genre fiction because you're building up your style. And once you get out there, you kind of know your limits, you know, what you can and what you can't do, but then you're also stifled in a lot of ways because you're not creating your own ideas because you're trying to follow a fully established paradigm. And so I'm going to lead right into the fact that, you know, you've done screenwriting. Okay. So tell us a little bit about the screenwriting that you have done.
So when I was an undergrad, my one positive experience with a creative writing course in an academic setting was actually with a screenwriting teacher in the film department. And I learned the trade. I learned kind of, you know, the formatting, the weird formatting stuff, like, you know, what a screenplay basically is, which I honestly found kind of hard to get my head around because I'm very much kind of like a novel writer at the end of the day. I love building atmosphere with words, and building kind of character with words too, and realizing that you can't do that with a screenplay was kind of a shock. So, you know, it's a completely different animal. That said, I experimented with writing Gothic screenplays in that class. Mm-hmm. And last year I basically kind of polished up and wrote a Gothic screenplay, basically about two nuns and the devil, which is exactly as weird as it sounds from that.
Oh, it just sounds like a normal day at church, right?
Yeah, in 15th century Spain. So yeah, I mean, I was actually kind of going for kind of a Ken Russell's The Devils, you know, Roger Corman, Spanish Inquisition vibe there. Mm-hmm. And I sent it out to the Women in Horror Film Festival. And yeah, I mean, they accepted it. I won kind of a runner-up award for it. Which was just a fantastic experience. I really was not expecting that, honestly, because I never actually sent a screenplay out before. So, yeah, the response was overwhelmingly positive, and yeah, I mean, I think that screenplay writing demands different things from you than novel writing. Mm-hmm. It really gets you to focus on things like plot and on how to define character and atmosphere through dialogue. And you really have to kind of trust whoever picks up your screenplay. If you don't intend to direct yourself, you really have to trust them to kind of, you know, read your screenplay in good faith, understand kind of the atmosphere that you want, and also, you know, to just kind of like let it go and realize that filmmaking is a collaborative process. Yeah. And you're really kind of creating a skeleton for them to kind of fill out.
Yeah, and that's another thing too, because you're still writing in another fashion. You're actually writing on two separate projects. One of them is the blog that you have out, and what's the name of that?
The blog is at sublimeterror.wordpress.com.
And that's exploring the Gothic genre that you already, like you were talking about before at the beginning of the show. And you said that you have kind of like a running book on there, right?
Yes, I do. I have, oh my God, I've been working on this for a couple of years, and it has actually reached about 140 pages. So wow. It's turned into quite the project, actually. The serial Gothic novel is called The Cost of a Rose or The Ordeal of Blood.
I like the fact that you got the double title. It's not something you see very often. We love it.
I love the double title. I mean, I'm really, really going for kind of very, very old school Gothic atmosphere. I mean, you know, we're talking like even pre-Dracula, like a century before Dracula. Sort of the, you know, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Godwin's, Caleb Williams, the Monk, all that stuff. So I'm kind of working with sort of those old school atmospherics and character types and trying to give it a little bit of a more modern bent in terms of prose and kind of narrative pacing. But that particular novel is basically kind of this ongoing cat and mouse game between this young man, Alan, who's been falsely accused of a crime, and this sort of bloodthirsty hanging judge, who's kind of obsessed with him and is part of this secret cabal, which I don't really want to get too much into because I don't want to give spoilers. But that's basically kind of the broader context of the plot, and there are all kinds of creepy subplots that go on in the background as well. I kind of love creating narratives that are like very dense. I love kind of world building. So yeah, there's a reason why it's kind of gotten up to 140 pages, and I think I'm still only halfway done with it. So
yeah, and I want to let our listeners know, and your readers know who may be already listening to this, you can follow this book as it's being created, and you can go to sublimeterror.wordpress.com and go ahead and jump on The Cost of a Rose or The Ordeal of Blood, and go ahead and follow it. And it's amazing because there's other services out there that kind of do this same thing, but at least you're getting a story that you can watch as it progresses, which is amazing when an author can do this, because it's almost as if they're pouring their emotions and their ideas out on paper and presenting it to you as the listener or the reader, saying, hey, this is what I'm all about. This is the story in my head as it unfolds and the ideas that come into being. Now I'm going to produce this and let you see it. And it's just a great idea. I think that this right here is the future of writing. And a lot of people have said that. So I do appreciate you building that up. But I would like to ask you if we can read an excerpt from the Cost of the Rose or the Ordeal of Blood. Would that be okay with you?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. And without further ado, here is The Cost of a Rose or the Ordeal of Blood. Chapter 26. Might and wrong combined, like iron magnetized, are endowed with irresistible attraction. Hawthorne. My tale, said the judge, begins centuries before my birth, with a peculiar bit of family history that was recounted to me by my father. It has, I believe you will agree, a resonance to my own more personal history, and to your own, Alan. You must recall the painting of my ancestor that you discovered earlier today, that man whose face I bear so striking a resemblance, even more so than to my own father. His name is Sir Alistair Compline, and he lived during the bloody, treacherous reign of Queen Elizabeth, a man in the service of the state whose zealous work in exposing traitors and Romish spies earned him a title and the blessing of the Virgin Queen herself. It was a time much like our own, Alan, when every man was weary of his neighbour, and even a twinkle of supposed treachery in a man's eyes could send him to the gallows. Or worse, that little bit of sport that I enjoyed at your expense, the horse-dragging, was a milder taste of many ingenious inventions of the torment that Englishmen devised during those years to wring confessions from those who might have other allegiance than to Her Majesty. And no wonder. After all, had they not so long before suffered at the hands of their ruthless sister Bloody Mary? Vengeance, my dear Alan, is a sweet incentive to a murder, or something worse. You contemplate your own remembered wrongs as they are bloodily recalled upon the body of your persecutor, and in that moment you become what he was, and he becomes what you were. In that way, the torturer and his victim, in exchanging roles, share the keenest form of sympathy imaginable. My ancestor Alistair Compline had been deeply injured by the papal persecutors, losing both a brother and a mother to their fanaticism. It was his own fanaticism, born of hatred rather than piety, that drove him at last into the service of Richard Topcliffe, member of the Parliament of the Queen's trusted enforcer. I see you start. You have heard, I suppose, of his reputation. In a few scattered histories, I replied. What have you heard? The judge rose from the sedan, the cigarello still smoking between his fingers, as he went to a low table of liquors that stood by the fire. I accepted the glass of dark whiskey and the fresh cigarillo that he offered, replying, I know that he was the Queen's chief torturer, that he was responsible for interrogating many Jesuit spies, or at least those who were believed to be spies, and of course that he was renowned for his cruelty. Yes, but your histories touch only the barest facts. Compline lit a long match at the flickering light of a candle and brought it close to me, letting me hold his wrist to steady the flame so that I might light the thin roll of tobacco. True, there were those details that emerged in the testimonies of certain priests who had enjoyed Topcliffe's hospitality. But there were stranger tortures that were never entered into the records, and of which, I suspect, there were fewer survivors left to testify. There was talk of prolonged strangulation, living burial, slow fires held against the tender skin of a man's back. Once I had lit the flame, he pressed my shoulder, before retiring again to the sedan opposite my chair. His gentleness of manner struck me as peculiar. Were it not for the dubious manner of our conversation, and of course the technicality that I was his prisoner, I could almost have believed that the man was courting me. And the ancestor was his accomplice in these cruelties? I asked, the judge's whiskey burning like a rich, radiant fire along my tongue and throat. His accomplice and his adviser, I was told as a boy that my great-great-great-grandfather Philip discovered detailed records kept by Sir Alistair of these priests' confessions, but he had them burned, as he feared that they might be found by an enemy and made public, to the scandal of our family name. He smiled a little. And Philip Compline, an adviser to the wonderfully libertine King Charles II, was a far worse man than Sir Alistair ever was. Because of Philip's fear of the family reputation, however, only one particular tale of his exploits have been carried to our present day. I was told this tale by my father, the Archbishop William Compline, when I was a boy. It was several days after the burial of my mother, and I listened attentively to his voice, just as I had when he preached my mother's funeral homily in Edinburgh, and I own that, when he had finished, I liked his tale of my ancestor far better. You see, Sir Alistair was a fanatic, but he was not a cold man. He fell in love. He burned for one of his victims, a devout Catholic girl with a family accused of hiding priests. His pleas for her relent, to convert, and to be his, were as useless as his tortures. He remained steadfast in her utter hatred for him, and at the end, when Topcliffe himself oversaw her final hours with Sir Alistair at his side, she cursed Sir Alistair with these words: "The world will burn for thee, and be possessed by thee, save for that one treasured thing that thou burnest for eternity. All of thy line shall so burn." And then her screams drowned the rest of her curse, or prophecy, or whatever you might call it. Or so my father told me, as we walked together upon the grounds of his mansion, watching our foresters pare back the thorns of our hedges. Now, as a child, I was not altogether certain of a motive that had prompted my father to relate such a morbid tale. There were more pride than horror in his smiling amusement at the quaint family curse, enough to where I could not discern if the tale was meant as a mortifying warning, or as an exultant proof of our family's destined authority. After all, the Papist girl had prophesied that the world would burn and be possessed by our line, and it was true that there had been a curious fortune that had blessed all of Sir Alistair's descendants. The cruel vicissitudes that savaged England, Scotland, and Ireland in the 2 centuries were nothing to us. The libertine Stuarts, the rebellious Irish of Ulster, the Puritan Parliament, and now the mad noble House of Hanover. Every faction, every revolt, every tyrant was one and the same to us. And all, Alan, served our turn. As I considered my family's history, the bitterness of our prophecy, I could not for the life of me discern, only the ambitious sweetness. My adversary paused in his tale to refresh his glass. My cigarette had gone out, and I crushed it in the iron plate in my hand, still watching him closely. There was something peculiar in his manner as he related this tale. I still perceived that strange gentleness, but it seemed now a strained and warm veneer, masking some restless and ill-restrained humor. You can imagine how such a tale might provoke a young man's imagination, he continued, swallowing the inch of whiskey that he had poured and served himself another glass. And when I was sent to school in London, and thence to Oxford, I carried the Nero-like prophecy in my heart like a wonderful private joke. I would even jest at it occasionally to my closet comrades and inflame them with its fearful fascination. My companions and I were sportive in those years, and little restrained us, save the limits of our own imagination. London was our glittering hunting ground, and with our fathers as the land's most prominent courtiers and lords, we could not but view its denizens as helpless before us. Like the gang of young lords who called themselves Mohawks in Fielding's day, we roamed the streets at night, choosing which victims would serve our turn until dawn. I was the natural leader of our merry band, though I was not the highest born. That honour was reserved for another young lord, the son of a Scottish Earl. This man had spent most of his youth in France, and had adopted the mannered courtliness and careless ostration of that country. Yet in spite of his proud and arrogant heart and high rank, when we roamed the streets together, he worshipped my every step. Outside of our nightly sporting, when we stood together in politer social gatherings, he was conscious of my peerage again. But when we were alone, or with our college friends, he was ruled utterly by me. At first, it became a whispered jest that the Earl's son was a slave of an archbishop's son. But when those who laughed found themselves unwilling guests at our nightly escapades, they learned to hold their merriness in check. Like me, the Earl's son was a connoisseur of torment. We would watch, raptly, as I sported with a handsome young man or a lovely girl, seeming less to notice their suffering and more to observe my cruelty. As an archbishop's son, it was not difficult for me to gain the keys to certain chapels close to our prowling walks beforehand, and we would conduct our business therein. I see you turn pale. You have already felt something of what I am capable of. I was younger then, and less imaginative, but I knew from their faces and their faltering steps when we at last released them, that they had felt my will. One I remember clearly, who, when we had at least released them, fainted away upon the altar steps. I confess that I sometimes laugh at the memory, for he was a superstitious one, and I believe that he thought he had been spirited away by devils that night, and had tasted the tortures of the damned. So you see, like my father, I converted souls, in my own way. And always, there in the flickering shadows and candlelight, where our own comrades stood by and smilingly offered their own torments or suggestions, the Earl's son stood and watched me, his gaze moving from my hands to my whip or needle that I had chosen for the night's sport, and finally to my face. He was particularly fascinated by my fondness for flogging my victims, or what he would sometimes jestingly call the English vice, as the French so scornfully termed it. Sensing that I had a strong partiality for it, he would press me for details, asking me from which Ulster I acquired my leather whips, and encouraging me to lengthen my sessions, even at the risk of my victim's life. I was careful not to go too far. I knew that even our privileges would not extend to so savage a murder. But I confess that with the encouragement of the Earl's son, we came close to disaster several times. Curiously, though, I would offer the whip to him and suggest that he taste this pleasure as well. He shook his head. "I prefer your hand to mine," he said. And he must have spoken the truth, for he seemed never to watch my victim, only my hand. I've said that the Earl's son was mine, that he was obedient to the letter, to my every word, and out of our band his attention to my wishes was the most severe. Being a young man and certain of my own destiny, his behavior seemed to confirm my most cherished prejudices, and I became more and more accustomed to his flattering attentions until, unbeknownst even to myself, I had begun to consider them indispensable. As a result, when he at last contradicted my will, I was far more provoked than I would have been had he not served me so wholly. It was a rejection of the reality that I had grown so fond of, and, as such, I felt must be punished without reservation. Worse, his contradiction amounted to a betrayal as well. He suggested that given his rank, it should be he who led our merry sporting, and not a mere archbishop's son. But he misjudged our companions, who were of a languid temperament and not inclined towards revolution if they could help it. When they saw my corresponding fury, they caught the energy of my familiar tyrant, rather than the new upstart. With their help, I fettered the Earl's son's wrists and tied him to the tall oaken bedpost in my Oxford chambers. I then flogged him for hours upon hours, until the sight of the blood flowing freely down his back quenched at my last fury. When I untethered him, he fell upon my bed, his face flushed and his breath still coming in ragged gasps. He caught my hand and pressed it to his lips. His eyes were glittering with a mingled vexation and excitement that was strange to behold. He had longed to usurp me, but he had also longed to be my victim. In the space of an evening, I had both thwarted his ambitious pride and granted him his unspoken wish. He was now more my creature than ever before. But the bitterness of his failed rebellion had irredeemably tainted our friendship. I held him in check with brute force and the mesmerism of my whip hand, but I could no longer trust him not to make some other attempt against my authority, as though to test whether I was still strong enough to rule him. As a result, from that day forth we shared a mutual fascination and a hatred for one another. My adversary paused in his tale to refresh his glass again. The liquor had lent his cheeks a faint flush and his eyes a colder, brighter light. As he silently contemplated me, I realized then how much I relied upon his self-restraint. If either his whiskey or his recollection of youthful exploits loosened their self-imposed bonds, I shuddered to think what might be my fate. "The Earl's son," I said. "Did you kill him?" Compline laughed then. "Kill him? My dear Alan, you will meet him within a week. He is Lord Allardyce, our host, and the man who headed my wish and had you delivered into my hands." "I don't understand." "You will in time. He is our sovereign of the secret court, in which I belong, and which you, Alan, having refused to pledge yourself to me, will serve as general property. He is the lord of the feast." "But you said that you hated one another. How can you belong to such a court, then, if he is its ruler?" "I said that we had come to hate each other, yes, but there is no bond stronger than the bond of a shared crime. Furthermore," he added with a smile, "I fear that his character has not altered considerably since our years in Oxford. He is still entrapped by my hand. There is more that I could tell you, but I believe that I have related what is pertinent to yourself. You are familiar with the character of our host. You have some shadowy anticipation now of what it is to be your fate in a week's time. You know of the quaint prophecy of my family that, since youth, has been my guiding creed. I am aware that though the world may be mine, that there will be that one object that eludes my grasp. You, Alan, will not be that cursed object. You will be mine." There seemed to be a threat that hovered upon the tip of his tongue, but that he restrained. For my part, I was stricken with a wild, despairing horror at the hellish prospect before me. I do not know exactly what I expected from the judge's history, but to learn that since youth he had imbibed the lessons of cruelty, and that there were others like him who I would likewise be subject to, filled me with more hopelessness than I had felt since my death sentence in court so many months ago. The family curse that he related seemed less a superstitious belief on his part and more peculiar obsession, as though the very notion of processing all the world would save one object maddened him. Indeed, his restraint in this insistence seemed predicated on his belief that his history had filled me with sufficient terror to wear down my reserve. As I remained silent, he rose and drew closer to me. "Alan, you have had all the time in the world. You know that I do not speak idly. You know that my purpose cannot be shaken. What? Will you not consent To be mine until I have utterly broken your spirit? My feelings were too complex at the moment to be fully comprehended, even by me. As I gazed upon my adversary, I felt all the bitter terror of my persecuted state, yet I also felt a peculiar awe at both the nature of the man before me, as well as the destiny that had drawn us two together. As he met my gaze, something of my unwilling admiration, I shudder to call it that, but it is the truth, was communicated to his heart, and a smile hovered at his lips. The sight of this smile overcome what little fortitude I had left, and I rose from my chair and turned towards the fire. The judge, sensing his cruel advantage, caught me by the shoulders and forced me to meet his gaze again. "Do you think that I can be made a fool of, Alan?" he said. "Do you believe me blind?" As I stood there, speechless, with bewildered terror, my heart beating like a trammeled bird, his brutality seemed suddenly to melt into something like tenderness. He drew me closer and set his lips against my brow, as he had done so many months ago in the midst of my flogging. At the touch of his lips, I felt myself unwillingly flooded with a sense of warm relief, and I loathed that he could provoke so strong a response in me, not only of terror, but of something like pleasure as well. What magnetism was it in him that, in spite of his monstrosity, compelled me to his side even as I resisted his overtures? As he held me, I longed to whisper for him to relent, for his affection to turn to something that did not demand my destruction at its sacrifice. Yet I knew that if I spoke, I would break the spell, and I would not have destroyed our blessed moment of peace for all the world. His final partaking kiss upon my brow felt like the benediction of a priest to a condemned heretic, and I confess that the strange unspeakable sympathy in my soul for my tyrant made me wish to consolate him in some level, so that I instinctively sought to return his gesture. But he smilingly withdrew from me, saying, "You have given me enough proofs of your affection tonight, my dear Williams." He then rang a bell that stood by the mantel, and when Gottfried entered, he nodded towards me. "Take him away. No, not to his chambers. I would have him chained in the cellar. I have something in mind by the way of preparation for our young guest before our long journey." All right, and we are back. You definitely capture the genre. I mean, it really does kind of pull you back to that ancient time. Were you a time traveler in another life? I'm just asking this as a general question.
I will plead the fifth on that.
Okay, that's good. So she is a time traveler, everybody who's out there. Okay, so her flux capacitor's in her car. Okay, so anyhow, we also want to talk about the other thing that you got going on. Like I told, the listeners here, it's amazing that you've got your hands in so many things, because as a writer, you have to do that. And you are also have been on the No Sleep podcast. And what did you appear in on that one?
So I had two stories actually appear in the 8th season. I had one story, Hand of Glory, which was in season 8, episode 5, and it's kind of an occult, sort of noirish horror story. Mm-hmm. And I had a Christmas horror story, kind of Christmas serial killer horror story, for their Christmas episode, season 8, episode 11.
Yeah. So I'm going to put the link to the podcast in the description of the video. And also, you've got your blog that you've got working on, and on the other projects that you have working on. If you wouldn't mind, just let me know what you have, and we'll put them in the description of the video, because we do appreciate any kind of writing on any kind of level. And I want to let everybody out there know that. We also have monthly competitions for short writing stories. You don't have to be a published author. You can be anybody who wants to write, because that's the goal of this show, is getting those original ideas out there. And because of that, I want to ask you, Colin, what advice would you give somebody who may be getting into screenwriting?
So my advice would be, I guess my advice would probably be trust other creatives. I think, and this is something I kind of tell myself too, when I think about, kind of entrusting my screenplays with another director. you have to understand that screenplays really are kind of guidelines. It's like you're writing a rule book. You're giving someone kind of your plot and the suggestion of these characters, but you really have to trust them with the atmosphere. That said, if you can kind of suggest that atmosphere, if you can suggest the world through dialogue, through the kind of spare directions that you can give throughout the screenplay, then by all means do that. But do not make the mistake that I made when I was a young screenplay writer of kind of having long paragraphs where you describe the characters or where you describe the setting. None of that is ever going to show up in the final movie because it's just not possible. Like, you know, they can't sort of send out a casting call of like, we need someone who looks exactly like this description in a screenplay. Like it's not going to happen. So kind of my first kind of advice would be understand that screenplays are not novels. They're not short stories. It's a completely different beast. And I think another bit of advice that I would give too, especially if you're a control freak like I am, try writing your story out like a short story first. Kind of, you know, envision it as the perfect movie that you want it to be. Write it out that way. And then write the screenplay. Like once you've really kind of understood your characters through the kind of like richer medium of the short story, then write the screenplay. I kind of actually wish that I had the time to do that in my screenplay writing course because I think that it would have made kind of, you know, fleshing the screenplay out a little easier. So I think those would be my two bits of advice. Yeah, really kind of try to understand your characters and your atmosphere first before diving into the screenplay. I'm sure there are people who can actually just kind of write the screenplay and not feel the need to get the characters and atmosphere down. Yeah. And I really envy that, honestly. But I think a lot of writers, especially writers who are used to writing prose, are a bit more control freaky. And I think kind of writing it out in traditional prose first and then translating that into a screenplay would be really helpful.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being here on the show. I really do appreciate it. It was a great talk. And I just want to let everybody else out there know that you can like, share, and subscribe to this channel in order to get all your updates on all your independent authors, writers, and soon we're going to be adding some extra stuff on the show. And Colin here was so gracious enough to come on to almost express a small part of that as being a screenwriter. So look forward for new updates here on the Emit Blackwell Show. And this is Emit Blackwell signing off. Keep on reading, keep on writing.
Are you troubled by strange noises?
Came out a 6-foot black silhouette of a cowboy with a cowboy hat. He had a death on.
You said there's lights in the sky?
Yeah, they're just pulling out. They're moving real slow. Real slow.
It's showtime.
The Emit Blackwell Show, diving into the creative minds of sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and paranormal authors. Their fantasy is our reality.